Hello everyone, I'm Alec Farquhar from the Disability and Work Canada Steering Committee. I'm pleased to introduce a session on measurement of progress on implementing policies and programs, Wednesday, December 2nd. We've made ambitious commitments in Canada under the UN Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, and the Accessible Canada Act. It includes a broad range of issues from the very highest level and right down to the grassroots frontline level. Regarding employment, persons with disabilities are trying to obtain employment. Employers and unions are striving to improve the recruitment and retention of people with disabilities. Service providers are providing frontline employment services, but how will we know if we're making progress? This panel is unique because we're focusing both on the top level of progress on implementing the very biggest initiatives, and also at the front line in terms of improving employment outcomes. There will be 3 presentations, all pre-recorded, followed by a live question and answer session, and we're really looking forward to your questions. We'll begin with Jeff Willbond, Director General of the Proactive Compliance Branch of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Jeff will speak to the role of the Commission through their national monitoring mechanism for the CRPD, as well as measuring progress in implementing the Accessible Canada Act. It's really important territory. We're just at the beginning stages, and you'll hear from Jeff more or less the framework of how that will be accomplished. Then we get into Stephen Tobin's presentation. Stephen's from the Labour Market Advisory Council. He's going to be focusing on the overall challenges of measuring progress on disability and employment. And as you'll see from Stephen's presentation, we face some real challenges in terms of the data sets available and being able to dig a little bit deeper into the data and understand all the dimensions of progress. So it's very much a work in progress. Then we'll finish with Jillian Hardie. Jillian is the CEO and Executive Director of the Challenge Disability Resource Group in the Yukon. And Jillian's going to focus at the more granular level of frontline measures of employment success that are tailored to the individual. So you're going to see the whole broad sweep of measurement issues, and you'll also see that we're working on them and there's quite a ways to go. You're going to have the pleasure of these 3 excellent presenters and looking forward to the question and answer session. Thanks very much.
Good day, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Jeff Willbond, and I'm very pleased to be participating on this panel and at this year's Disability at Work conference. As the new Director General of Proactive Compliance at the Canadian Human Rights Commission, I'm responsible for the accessibility team that will undertake the compliance promotion and enforcement work the Commission is responsible for under the Accessible Canada Act. As you can see, I'm working from home like most of us, and I'm participating virtually with this conference, and it's a little unusual. I mean, we would have all liked to have come together and to have done this in person, but you know what? It's so important in terms of today's discussion and the topic of accessibility and inclusion, and I think that's what we would most appreciate. So we're going to have the conversation and we're going to have the dialogue. As you are aware, the Accessible Canada Act builds on the Canadian Human Rights Act and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in promoting and protecting the rights of people with disabilities. I'm going to first speak about the Accessible Canada Act, and then I'm going to share some information with you regarding our role in monitoring the United Nations Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities. The purpose of the Accessible Canada Act is to achieve a barrier-free Canada by 2040. So, what is accessibility? Accessibility is the extent to which environments, buildings, technology, goods and services, information, and opportunities are available to as many people as possible, well beyond just the built environment. And why is accessibility important? Well, accessibility is a human right. In addition to this, accessibility represents the opportunity for all of us, an opportunity to serve an evolving customer base in a rapidly changing world, an opportunity to tap into a labor market, to better reflect in our business planning and workplaces and communities in which we live, to increase consumer spending power, and to improve services to all Canadians. An accessible world makes sense for all of us. The Accessible Canada Act is a proactive compliance legislation. This is a very progressive piece of legislation. This is a real shift in the approach to disability rights, taking the burden off of people with disabilities. And it's exciting because we will have different ways to measure and ensure accountability for progress that will hopefully result in real changes in day-to-day lives of people with disabilities. The Act requires employers and service providers under federal jurisdiction to take proactive measures to identify and remove barriers to accessibility, prevent the creation of new barriers, and to achieve the highest level of accessibility for people with disabilities. When I speak of the federal jurisdiction, I'm referring to industries such as banking, telecommunications, transportation industries, and of course, the Government of Canada. Restaurants, schools, and businesses typically fall under the jurisdiction of provincial legislation. How is this new and different? People with disabilities no longer have to wait until discrimination has occurred or to file a complaint. The onus has switched from the individual to the organization, and for the organization to proactively identify and remove barriers. It is important to note that there will be a complaint process associated with the Accessible Canada Act to address accessibility complaints. However, the Act puts emphasis on being proactive and hopefully, in most cases, resolving issues and barriers in advance of a complaint needing to be filed in the first place. The legislation is complex. There are multiple agencies responsible for different aspects of the legislation. The legislation creates 3 new bodies: Accessibility Standards Canada, which will be responsible for creating accessibility standards; the Accessibility Commissioner, a member of the Canadian Human Rights Commission who will oversee compliance and enforcement with the Act, along with a few partner organizations; and lastly, the Chief Accessibility Officer, who will act as an advisor to the minister and oversee the overall functioning of the legislation. The Canadian Human Rights Commission partners in our compliance promotion and enforcement work with the Canadian Transportation Agency, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, and the Federal Public Service Labor Relations and Employment Board. To ensure cooperation and coordination between these bodies, these organizations have established the Council of Federal Accessibility Agencies, where the Chief Commissioner, my boss, sits as chair. It is important to note that changes may not happen as quickly as we would hope. The creation of the new organizations take time. Further, there is a commitment to consult with people with disabilities as the legislation is being implemented, which is important and deserves the time it takes. The Act recognizes that people with disabilities are the experts with lived experiences. The successful implementation of the Act will depend on the fundamental principle of inclusion. And those who are affected and whose rights are implicated need to be a critical part of the creation, delivery, and assessment of the legislation and the regulations. It is in the coming years, regulations will require that regulated entities develop and publish an accessibility plan in consultation and collaboration with the disability community, introduce a feedback mechanism, and a report on progress made annually. These plans will require the identification, removal, and prevention of new barriers in the following areas as regulations come into force: employment, the built environment, information and communication technology, the procurement of goods and services, the delivery of programs and services, transportation, and communications other than information, communication, and technology. Reflecting on the theme of this panel discussion, while regulations specific to employment have not yet been developed, once they are, the Canadian Human Rights Commission and the Accessibility Commissioner will measure progress in this area in the same way we are currently proposing measure progress on plans, feedback mechanisms, and progress reports, and the duty to consult people with disabilities. Our accessibility team is currently working really hard to design an oversight approach to ensure we have a robust program in place to promote compliance with the Accessible Canada Act, and where necessary, take enforcement action to get to compliance. In other words, ensuring that organizations and service providers are doing everything they are required to do to achieve accessibility requirements of the Act. So what does this mean? We are going to hire and train inspectors so that we have people with the right knowledge and expertise who can assess and report back to the Accessibility Commissioner on compliance. This will be very important in terms of measuring and reporting progress on accessibility. Many of you know that we are waiting for the arrival of the Accessibility Commissioner. The process to appoint this person is well underway. The Accessibility Commissioner will have many responsibilities, including those related to measurement and evaluation. For instance, the Commissioner is required to submit a report to the Minister each year. The report on items such as inspections conducted, enforcement actions, and complaints received. Importantly, the Accessibility Commissioner also has the authority and responsibility to disclose any systemic or emerging accessibility issues in the areas they oversee. The overall system oversight of the legislation lies with the Chief Accessibility Officer, and as I said earlier, that person is acting as an advisor to the Minister. Now, although the obligation to comply with regulatory requirements is still a ways away, organizations, including my organization, the Canadian Human Rights Commission, can take steps now to make our place of employment or service more accessible. One way to do this is to hire people with disabilities. I'm really proud to state that the accessibility team at the Commission is staffed with many people with lived experience in different disabilities, including myself. As many of you are aware, last June, when the Act received royal assent, the Commission was formally designated as the body responsible for monitoring the Government of Canada's implementation of the United Nations Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. As the national monitoring mechanism, it is the Commission's job to track and report on progress that Canada is making and the implementation to identify gaps and problems that need to be fixed. It is also the Commission's responsibility to work with partners to make recommendations about how to fill gaps and to fix those problems. In this work, the Commission will work with people with disabilities, caregivers, families, organizations that represent persons with disabilities. The Commission wants the monitoring work to be meaningful for people with disabilities and contribute to real change. There are many ways the Commission can do this. For example, by preparing reports, providing education, making recommendations on laws and policies, among others. However, before deciding what monitoring will look like, the Commission is engaging people with disabilities and organizations to gather information on stakeholder objectives, expectations and priorities relating to monitoring the implementation. For instance, this past June and July, the Commission launched an online survey asking people across Canada to weigh in on its role in monitoring the Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In total, the survey received nearly 3,000 responses. Some preliminary results of note include the following. 64% of participants identified as having a disability. 54% of participants think that the Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities will have a positive effect for people with disabilities in Canada. And the top issues or areas of concern, which are no surprise to you, were poverty, housing, work, and employment. Therefore, the Commission's current priorities are to engage communities to build awareness about the Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the monitoring mechanism and why it matters. Build a model for monitoring that is truly collaborative and cooperative and ensures active engagement and the involvement of people with disabilities and the organizations representing. Identify stakeholder expectations and priorities with respect to monitoring, identifying what the monitoring mechanism should be, and identifying specific activities, work, and outputs that could or should be produced, and overall identifying what success actually looks like in our community. The Commission has these two new exciting mandates in Accessible Canada Act and the United Nations Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we are just beginning on building these programs, but we are building them so we can measure progress, measure success, and adjust along the way for even more success. I look forward to answering any questions you may have. And again, I'm really happy to be participating in this year's panel and conference. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Stephen Tobin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Labour Market Information Council, a pan-Canadian not-for-profit organization whose aim is to help Canadians navigate career and employment decisions through improved labour market information and insights. In this space, an important element of consideration for us is to better understand the labour market information needs of Canadians. What kinds of information and data do they need to make a more informed decision regarding their employment and training options? To this end, we conducted a range of public opinion surveys with a series of population groups, including employers, recent graduates, recent immigrants, students, parents, and persons with disabilities. For persons with disabilities, we found that not only are they faced with the usual challenges of finding information relevant to them, but the vast majority of the time, the information they find is not accessible to them. In addition, one of their most sought after pieces of labour market information, workplace environment, was not easily available. And as we think about improving employment outcomes, for us at the Labour Market Information Council, we need to consider how to improve data that can support these employment, career, and training decisions. And this entails closing gaps in the actual information available, such as workplace environment, but also in how the information is shared and digested, taking into account the unique ways that different people consume and process information. And more specifically on the topic of employment outcomes and how we can measure progress, there are two central issues in my mind for discussion. The first relates to our ability to report out on general labour market and employment outcomes for persons with disabilities. These can be useful when setting benchmark objectives for things like employment rates, employment creation, or participation rates. The most common example in my mind is that, of course, in the European Union, with such examples as the Lisbon Strategy, or more recently, the EU 2020 Strategy that set targets for things like labour force participation. In Canada, we don't have any such targets. And the reality is, when it comes to reporting on employment outcomes for persons with disabilities, we simply do not have the data to report out regularly and in a systemic way. Our main source of labour market intelligence is, of course, the monthly labour force survey, but it does not capture information on persons with disabilities. Of course, other surveys exist, such as the census, or most recently, the Canadian Survey on Disability. They offer great detailed insights, but they collect information only every 5 years and are really thus too infrequent to report on employment outcomes in a meaningful or regular manner. The most recent data dates to 2017. Interestingly, recent initiatives from Statistics Canada to gather information through crowdsourcing is a novel approach. In August, for example, some 13,000 Canadians with long-term conditions or disabilities responded to a crowdsourced survey to gauge the impact of COVID-19 on persons with disabilities. For the moment, such approaches, while interesting, remain ad hoc. And of course, the results are based on those who only answer the survey and thus may not be very representative and would be difficult to replicate in the future. Nevertheless, these innovative approaches such as crowdsourcing give us possible insights as to how we might collect such information on a regular basis. There are other possible avenues to explore. For instance, administrative data, such as tax returns, have enormous potential to provide insights on an annual basis. There are some challenges, however, to overcome. First, the data do come with some time lag, that is usually 18 months after the tax year with which your taxes are filed. But more fundamentally, for the moment, such administrative data does not capture employment status or occupation. Although we could think maybe about how we could proxy employment outcomes by looking at income from employment as reported on an individual's tax return. In my view, in looking at the various sources that are currently available, the administrative data approach offers the most promise as we sort of chart data collection going forward. But we must reconsider the purpose of such administrative data, how we collect it. So we need to add valuable labor market information, such as employment and occupation, so what we collect. And of course, given the sensitive nature of tax data, we need to carefully consider how it is disseminated to ensure anonymity. And while having metrics of this nature will be an important step in the right direction to better understand how we are doing, these broad indicators of outcome do little to tell us what is working in terms of policies and programs. Which brings me to my second issue related to employment outcomes, and that is the culture of program and policy evaluation in Canada. Currently, we invest hundreds of millions of dollars every year in Canada on policies and programs to improve labor market outcomes, including for persons with disabilities, but our approach to evaluating such programs is lacking. Much of our current approach to evaluating programs focuses too narrowly on qualitative results, short-term outcomes, and limited comparison or control groups. The classic program evaluation question asks participants if they thought the program was useful. While important, this is not a terribly good measure of success. Second, quite often for program interventions, we measure employment outcomes only 6 months after any given training or support. While useful, we know that returns to training programs often take time to accumulate, and we should be measuring employment outcomes, of course, over a longer period of time. And finally, there is limited efforts to create comparison groups in our program evaluation approach. For instance, even in the case where 80% of participants found employment following an intervention. Sounds successful, right? But what if without any intervention at all, 85% of similarly unemployed persons over the same period found a job? Looks a little less successful, right? And while I recognize that more stringent evaluations and a different approach to measuring success of this nature would require additional resources, it should be a core element of how we approach employment programs and outcomes in Canada. It will allow us to better figure out what works and what does not, and thus improve the effectiveness of future programming. Right now, too little effort is spent on evaluating programs in a rigorous measure, limiting our approach to truly capture employment outcomes. To conclude, currently we have very little sources of information from which we can report regularly on employment outcomes for persons with disabilities, but there are new and innovative approaches that offer promise. However, even with those in place, it will offer us little in terms of what is actually working. And in my view, there is greater promise in understanding employment outcomes if we do a better job at instilling a culture of evaluation in our current programming of training and employment measures designed to help persons with disabilities get better jobs. And promoting a culture of evidence and data and recognizing that there is value in knowing what works and what does not. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jillian Hardie, the Executive Director for Challenge Disability Resource Group in Whitehorse, Yukon. I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about performance measurement. Something that we didn't do very well for many, many years was measuring the work that we were doing. And so we started working with an organization called Lift Philanthropy Partners on developing that performance measurement framework. So where we started with was our North Star. What do we see as a goal for the organization to know that we've achieved success for our clients, with our clients? When we see individuals with disabilities are empowered, included, and recognized for the contributions that they can make in the Yukon, then we know we have achieved what we are striving for. When we're working with the individuals to live their best life, to work in their favorite job, and to be contributing members of our community, then we know we've achieved our goals. So once we looked at our North Star, we then started to work backwards from there, looking at our long-term, medium-term, and short-term outcomes. Short-term outcomes, they're always easy to measure and to track. The long-term ones, how do you do that? So I'll just talk about our first ones from each of the groups and move down. So our long-term outcome here was persons with disabilities have independence and engagement in the community life in Yukon. How do you measure that? How do you know that they're engaged? Well, look at what some of those indicators are. We know that everybody's got their own personal goals. And so we look at their personal plans and work with them to achieve their goals, the ones they decide are important for them. I don't want somebody choosing my goals for my life. So let's help them choose their own goals for their lives. So once they've identified what their goals are, now we've got something to measure. What are those indicators? So let's say we have an individual who wants to be a chef. Excellent. Where are we going to start? Well, I can only work 4 hours a day. Perfect. Let's start there. What do you need? What skills do you need? And you're working backwards. So once that person has gained that those goal of becoming a chef, we know that they have gained some independence, that they're engaged in their community because they're working. They're involved in their community because they're a chef in their community. So we look at their long-term goals, and that is what the indicator is going to be. Just scrolling up on my screen here in front of you. So then we looked at what are some of the medium-term outcomes that we want to look at. Participants have improved work skills and feel confident about their present and future employment. I wonder what the indicators for that might be. You know, what is their confidence like? How do you measure confidence? It's actually easier than you think. Are they attending class or their work site? Have they increased their hours? What was it like when they first started using a before survey? And what is it like now? Maybe 6, 8, 12 weeks later, maybe 6 months later, maybe a year later. But you're using a before and after survey to kind of measure what that looks like. Are they coming into work? Have they learned the specific skills for their jobs? Are they communicating with their employers? So how do you measure confidence? Do they feel confident to share their skills with others? Maybe we need to ask their caregivers, people that they live with. Maybe we need to look at the broader community, their families. So if we look at the person who maybe wanted to be a chef, is he teaching other people around him? Is he teaching his girlfriends or her boyfriend or girlfriend, boyfriend, or partners in lives? Are they teaching their friends? You know, we had a report one time from a parent who called up and says, guess what? Joe taught me how to use a knife. I've been cooking all my life and I never knew. That's how you use a knife. So are they teaching the people around them? Do they feel that confidence inside to teach the skills that they have learned? So we're looking at caregivers to give those reports, family members, friends. You know, you reach out to people in their lives. Are they engaging? And themselves, look out to the participants themselves. Are they communicating that they've learned all these skills and they're feeling more confident and their work skills have increased? So then if we look at some of the short-term ones, those are the easy ones, right? So what are they learning right away? So we looked at, have they developed routines and a sense of belonging and commitment, trust and motivation? Motivation, how do you measure motivation? Are they getting up? Are they coming into class? Have they worked on their sleep-wake cycle, which is a really huge issue for many of our clients that we're working with? Are they exhibiting patterns of healthy living? So are they interested in changing diet? Are they interested in changing their sleep-wake cycles? Are they taking their medications regularly because they feel better? Do they feel more confident about sharing what their disabilities are? So have they developed some of those routines? We can also look to the employers. Have the employers gotten back to us to say, yes, they're attending work regularly, they're participating with their other coworkers, they're interacting, and have they learned to trust you? Trust is such a big piece of the work that we do. And so we need to really develop those relationships, and that's where we can get some of the best data to record. And it's not always about the data. You know, the relationship is what works in the work we do. But we can take some of that relationship work and put it into data so that we can record the great work that we are doing. And that is what's really important for our funders. They need to see that. So we can ask our employers, we can look at the relationships that we're building with the people that we're serving. We can look to the caregivers. Are there people in their lives? And have they developed that? So we really want to look at what our short, medium, long-term goals are, our overarching goal. Then we want to look at all of those little pieces and keep track of them. Now, how long are we going to report on this? We need to decide, are we going to report monthly, quarterly, biannually, annually? We need to figure out how often we need this information in order to be able to provide those outcomes, results. Lots of times, the short-term outcomes, you're going to be looking at that weekly, bi-weekly sometimes, very, very regularly. Whereas our medium terms, we might look at quarterly, and our long term, we might look biannually or annually or even longer. We've worked with clients that have started out with, maybe working 1 hour a week who are now supervisors 10 years later. So it takes some people longer, and that's okay, but we need to measure the results along the way. So I hope this was helpful, and I really thank everybody for attending today, and I look forward to hearing more in the workshop this afternoon.